Peter Deakin, a gifted storyteller, captivates readers with The Parchment, a historical novel set against the backdrop of the Dark Ages. The tale journeys through a turbulent world where faith, knowledge, and survival intertwine. A remarkable story of resilience, it centers on the discovery and preservation of ancient wisdom during a time of monumental change. Let's welcome to this new episode of Conoscere TV the author of The Parchment. Hi, Peter. Welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Geneva. I'm delighted to be here. Saluti a tutti.
So, Peter, we are honored to have you here today. Can you start by telling us what was the inspiration to start writing The Parchment and what it is about, please?
Well, look, it had a number of things that fed into it, and it was evolving over a period of many years. But the main thing that I started thinking about it all was really a book by Lord Kenneth Clarke, an Englishman who wrote a book called Civilization. And at the beginning of that book, he said of the Dark Ages that civilization was hanging on by the skin of its teeth. And it made me realize that civilization is not to be taken for granted, and it is actually quite a vulnerable institution. And it got me thinking about, well, how is it that some places survive and other places don't? And one of the places that I found amazing that it has survived is St. Anthony's Monastery in Egypt, which was founded in the 5th century. And it is still operating to this day. And empires have come and gone, armies have come and gone, civilizations have collapsed, and yet that monastery is still there. So I wanted to construct a story starting in Egypt at a dramatic time in its history, of course, when the Muslim invasion occurred, and bringing a precious parchment out of Egypt and all the way up into Italy to have it, hopefully to have the hieroglyphics translated, because they couldn't understand hieroglyphics by that stage. So that's really the principal inspiration. But I wanted to say a few other things, but I basically wanted to write an adventure story because this is my first novel and I wanted it to be exciting. So there's a lot happening in the book and hopefully readers will enjoy it.
Yeah, the story actually is really captivating. And those who have read the book already know that it is full of details and vivid imagery. How did you approach the research process for the setting in The Parchment?
It does need a lot of research, obviously, and of course you have to take your head back into the 7th century as well, which makes it a difficult task as well. My main inspiration as far as the settings are concerned is that I had to travel through those areas. So there's a couple of exceptions, but in almost every place described in the book, I had to make sure, of course, it was there in the 7th century. And I had to travel through it to try to get a feel for the place and to get an understanding of what it might have been like in the 7th century. And I think I couldn't have done it without traveling through most of those areas because you just can't capture enough of what really, I think, comes out of those areas without traveling through it. And you might be pleased to know that I spent most of the time in Italy writing the book because I was fortunate enough to be able to stay with my sister and her husband, and it was a complete removal from my other life. And I was able to sit there undistracted and just sat at the computer and worked through the story. Most of it just came straight out of my head. It didn't. I never seemed to have struggled to try to find where this is going or what comes next.
Well, one of the most compelling elements is the journey of Petrus and the challenges he faces. How did you develop his character, and what does he symbolizes in a broader narrative?
Yeah, well, look, I think the easiest way to answer that question, Ginevra, is to say that there's a little bit of me in all of the three male characters. So Petrus is obviously a version of me at a stage in my life. And I did want to convey the impression that he was very naive and he had very limited experience when the story started. But he was entrusted as being the carrier of the parchment, and I think he took his responsibilities very seriously. And I hope one of the things that worked in the book is that he did develop as a person and became a much better rounded person, and became a much stronger individual in the course of his journey. I think it's that development which hopefully people will understand. He had a very troubled childhood, that he was so traumatic when he was taken from his mother as a very young boy, that he couldn't even remember anything other than her screaming. And it took him quite a while. And there's a fairly dramatic development right at the end of the book, which I'm not going to ruin by telling everybody about it, where we actually learn where he did come from. And it's a nice ending, I think, to have that disclosed right at the end of the book.
Well, yeah, we won't spoil the end of the book, but we can say that the novel intertwines themes of faith, of knowledge, of survival. What is the general message that you hope readers take away from this reading?
Well, look, I do want people to basically enjoy it as an adventure story, but at the same, and I'm not trying to preach to people or convert them to any philosophy or anything. It's certainly not meant to be a religious book or a political book, but I do think people have to start thinking about all of the things that are contributing to a decline in our shared values, and the fact that there is so little now in Australia and in Europe, to the extent that I do know a bit about Europe, that there's not very much now that is uniting us. We've got far more things that are dividing us. And I do want people to think about it. And I thought a very good way to illustrate that is to show a time in history when civilization was really hanging by a very frail thread, and to have them realize just how easy it can disappear. There's a quotation from Will Durant at the beginning of my book, but I had another one that I found only recently that I thought was actually pretty good as well. And he says that civilization takes a century to develop and it can disappear in a day. And I think that's a pretty good illustration of really what I'm trying to say, that it's just something we take it for granted because we've enjoyed it for so long and we've had relative peace and a lot of prosperity. But we shouldn't assume that it will last if we don't look after it. It's like anything else. And I think it's a precious plant that needs to be carefully looked after and not taken for granted. And so that's one of the messages that I do want people to think about.
Peter, thank you very much for the insights that you offered us today, for your participation, and we wish you best luck with the book.
Thank you very much, Geneva. It was a pleasure.
The Parchment, written by Peter Deakin, is now available in bookstores and digital platforms. It's a publication by Eurobox.